So today we're going to be looking at the human skull, the skull which is part of the axioskeleton, and the skull can be divided into two regions, the cranial and facial bones. We have 8 cranial bones in the skull and 14 facial bones in the skull as well. For the cranial bones, the majority of them are single bones, except for two pairs. And for the facial bones, it's pretty much the opposite of that. The majority of facial bones are pairs, where only two facial bones are considered single bones. I'll start first with the cranial bones, but first I'll move the skull to like a lateral position right here. And I'll start with the frontal bone, located right here at your forehead area. And the frontal bone is basically the bone that is in charge of covering the frontal lobe of your brain. Then we'll move on to the sphenoid bone, located here, uh, just inferior to the frontal bone. And the sphenoid bone basically is the bone that articulates with all 8 of the cranial bones. Let me see here. Let me go ahead and just move this right here so we could get like an inferior view of the skull. And let me zoom in. So here we see the sphenoid bone, and basically the sphenoid bone takes a resemblance to a butterfly when we look at it here through the inferior view. And let me go back over here to the lateral view of the skull again. And the next bone I want to talk about is the ethmoid bone, which is located basically under the frontal bone, and it's located here also in front of the sphenoid. The next cranial bone is the occipital bone, located here in the back, basically the back of your head. And the occipital bone is in charge of covering the occipital lobe of your brain. Then I'll move on to the pairs of the cranial bones, starting first with the parietal bones, located here on the sides. From this lateral view, we are seeing the right parietal bone. And if I were to move this to the opposite side, we'll be looking at the left parietal bone. Now for the next pair, we'll be looking at no further but to the temporal bones, which are located here inferiorly to the parietal bones. The temporal bones, which are also a pair. And now let me go ahead and move on to the facial bones, and which the facial bones are all considered pairs except for two bones. And we'll start with one of the single facial bones, the mandible here. Considered the jawbone. The mandible here is considered to be the strongest facial bone that we have. The next facial bone that we are going to be looking at is the vomer, which we can see if I turn the skull into an anterior position. The vomer is located just right here below the nasal septum. It's a small bone, kind of hard to see, but it's located around this area. And speaking of the nasal septum, we'll be looking here at the nasal bone, located superiorly to the vomer. And the nasal bone here makes up the bridge of your nose, basically. And the next facial bone that we'll be looking at is the nasal conchae, located right here. The right nasal conchae and the left nasal conchae. And then we'll look at the lacrimal bones located right here. Next are the zygomatic bones located over here. And zygomatic is basically a fancy name for cheekbones. These are your cheekbones. And now let me turn the skull into inferior view one more time so we can look at the next bones. And we see here the palatine bones located right here at the roof of your mouth, the right and left palatine bone. And finally, we'll go ahead and look at the the maxillary bones located right here. And the maxilla basically articulates with the majority of facial bones.